What's up, y'all? It's Tyler,
And I'm Miracle.
and I'm going to tell you the time that we took acid in the forest. This is an LSD trip report. Let's do this.
I felt that one.
Yeah. You feel it, right?
How we obtained the acid is still unclear. However, we do remember that we definitely wanted to trip in nature. We wanted to be outside in some capacity. And so I started looking into campsites in the Sam Houston National Forest. I found a good campsite near a body of water, and it seemed isolated enough from other campers that were signed up for that same weekend, so it worked out. So we paid for the entry and per person and the campsite and everything, and we got into the actual park, which was massive, and the trees are, I think, something like 100 years old, and so these huge trees, we're driving through, getting to the campsite, and eventually we find our campsite, and sure enough, it was pretty isolated. I mean, I think our nearest neighbor was 2 campsites over on one side, and then there wasn't anyone on our other side, but even across from them. So it was nice and isolated, which worked out later on. We get to the campsite, we set up everything. Around 3 p.m., we decided to go ahead and drop, since we knew it was going to take a while for it to hit us. And we decided to walk the trail. So we're walking around, and I decided to play one of my favorite albums, which is the Psychedelic Swamp by Dr. Dog. And we're listening to this album, interestingly enough, right next to this swampy pond body of water that led into a larger lake. But where we were walking around the trail was on the other side, further away from the lake, but there was still some water there. And so we're sitting on this bench in a psychedelic swamp as we start essentially the ascension. We sit on the bench, and that's where everything started.
So when we say we, there was actually a third member whose identity remains anonymous today. So I think for today, we're going to call him Cam.
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 Yeah.
And Cam is a really interesting character. And I remember when we were walking around on the trail, he was looking at these plants, and they're the type of ancient plant that I think you call them Cretaceous period. So before plants had flowers, they were just leaves, and they didn't reproduce with flowers. So it's like this ancient type of plant. So our friend Cam was looking at this plant, and he called it Herbaceous Crustaceous. And I feel like that's only something that he would say. So anyway, like Miracle was saying, we were listening to that Dr. Dog Swamp, what was it? Psychedelic Swamp.
Yes.
And we were sitting on the bench, and I feel like Miracle was calm during the come up, but both me and Cam, we were shaking our legs furiously, like, restless leg syndrome. It was like that, but we were like crackheads, like how much we were shaking our legs. And I feel like there's something about LSD that does that to me, and I guess I infected my friend, or maybe he was feeling the exact same thing, but it's just this energy that you get in your legs. It feels like you have lightning legs or something.
But she was not doing fine during the come up. Like Morgan Freeman, like, because you're like, I think I feel like I was holding it together pretty well during the come up, but what was happening, I felt as if my spirit was being launched, and my body was the launch tower. And if you've ever watched a rocket launch, or especially during the shuttle missions, you'll see that there's a launch tower and an arm that connects to the shuttle stack. And so I felt as if my spirit was going to be launched, and my body was the tower, just kind of making sure that the guidance system was apt. Well, after that, as I was ascending, it really felt like an elevator. It felt like an infinite elevator just blasting me. It felt upward. It felt like I was being blasted upward.
What if that's like the direction that your ego dissolves? Your ego dissolves up into space.
Yeah, you become this like celestial being.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of ties into what happens later, right? With the stars. And
Yes.
I feel like the analogy of a rocket is dead on, especially if the come up is like really strong. It's just like being strapped to a rocket, except you're not even strapped. You don't even have a seatbelt. You're just going for it and like hoping that you don't just totally fail the mission.
So, after the three of us were done on the bench, we decided to walk back to our campsite. And at this point, we're all pretty much either still coming up or close to being wherever we're landing, in a sense. Because I remember feeling a distinct, we're there. It was rocket launch, rocket launch, rocket launch. We've arrived. And this space was still Earth, obviously, but it felt more of like an energetic database. And what was interesting was at this point, it was starting to get cold. And so we decided to build a fire. And there was this hilarious moment that kept recurring. When we were building the fire, as we were trying to build the fire, Tyler kept mentioning to use lighter fluid. And so I'd be like, yeah, okay, we'd use it. And then it just seemed like it was just a recurring motif within a short span of time. Whenever we were building the fire, you'd be like, you know what this could use? Some lighter fluid. And I would just laugh. After the lighter fluid fiasco, I was laughing like a fool. We were all, gathering sticks to build this fire. At one point, I was breaking a branch to throw it into the fire. But when that happened, whenever I heard the snap of the branch, I felt as if I was transported to a different dimension. My physical body was very much still on Earth, but my spiritual body was being transported to a different dimension. And in that dimension, I was in the same dimension that all spirits go to whenever they're in altered states of consciousness. And I felt all of my ancestors there. It felt as if I had tapped into this place outside of space and time where all these spirits all throughout history go whenever they're in altered states of consciousness. And my ancestors were there. And, whether they were experiencing a mushroom ceremony or maybe, who knows, something even further beyond that in time, or back in time, I should say. But whatever it was, they were proud of me. My ancestors, I felt them and they were proud of me, as if me having this experience on LSD was a necessary rite of passage. Thank you. It was a interdimensional pat on the back.
That's what that was.
Yeah, I felt it. I felt my ancestors there too.
So at this point, our friend Cam puts on some music. He brought a little boombox and he had some CDs. He put on an album that I had never heard before called Medulla by Bjork. And this song comes on, Oceania, and it's really cool because it just has this very soulful vocal, like this line that she like belts the vocal line. The lyrics are like this pagan worship of the ocean. So it's kind of like the lyrics are describing how we all descend from the ocean and the ocean is our mother, and how the salt that comes from our sweat is like because we are creatures born of the ocean. And it was just really profound because when you have LSD, you feel this very like macro sense of everything, like how you're connected to the world at large and nature and even deep time and evolution and things like that. So it was just like really hitting home, especially once I fully learned the lyrics. But even just that initial like emotional feeling that I got from the music, it like really was one of the more inspiring things that I took away from this trip.
Listening to Bjork was phenomenal. It was the perfect album to play, honestly. Medulla is now, to this day, one of my favorite albums because of that night. At one point, I was walking away to use the restroom. Also, just as a personal side note, this is where being isolated came in handy because we were blasting that boombox pretty loud, but it didn't seem like once I got to a certain distance from the campsite, I couldn't hear it at all, but I could still hear it faintly as I was walking away. And I just remember being like, we are so lucky that we found that site where it is, and it just felt so perfect. So I go to the restroom, and I've always heard people say, don't look at yourself in the mirror when you're tripping. And I don't know if that necessarily pertains to in general, or maybe if you're already having a bad experience, but I was having a wonderful time. And so I went ahead and looked at myself in the mirror, and for the first time I actually felt beautiful. And I feel kind of embarrassed saying that now, but in all honesty, just as in a vulnerable moment right now, I've struggled with self-esteem and with self-image and comparison with societal standards of beauty. And so this moment was pivotal for me, because before this I had never felt myself as attractive. So looking at myself, not only did I find myself physically attractive, but I was really grateful for my existence, that I was just floored by myself. I don't know how else to put it, but I was looking at myself and I felt like I fell in love with myself, telling myself, wow, you're this amazing being, and you're beautiful. Why don't you see that otherwise? And so that moment was really important. I tried to hold on to that even to this day.
So we're still coming up on our trip. We're approaching our peak. And of course, this fire needs some more lighter fluid. When we were sitting there, as we started to approach our peak, one of the things that I noticed, this is kind of in general about psychedelics, is that when your brain becomes filled with all of these like new thoughts and feelings and stuff when you're tripping really hard, one of the first things to go is actually your sense of spatial awareness. Kind of like you don't have the same sense of like where things are in relation to you and around you, and even, you know, you might even like lose your balance or something because everything is just not as stable as it normally would be. So I was really noticing this when we were approaching the peak and we were sitting next to each other on the little log next to the fire. I think all three of us were sitting like probably about this close, if not closer. And I was closing my eyes, you know, because I was kind of just in my head and seeing a little bit of visuals and stuff. And what I noticed is that I felt like I was blurring into them. Like I couldn't even distinguish my own boundary with them. It was almost as if we were like cuddling, but it was almost like our souls were going like this. And we were like, there was no boundary between us. Even though we weren't physically touching, it felt like we were overlapping, and that I was like laying on them in a sense. Like my soul was like diagonally going through theirs. It was pretty crazy. And that's something that's really hard to explain. So you don't say anything when it's happening. You just kind of live it. As we're basically peaking at this point, things just start to get really ridiculous and funny. Especially just because of the crew that was involved, you know, me and her and our other friend. So this is just like a recipe for just absurdity. And so we were just laughing hysterically and having a really good time, and like who knows what even made sense about what we were talking about during the peak. We made corn on the cob. We just cooked the corn over the fire, and it was just like this super visceral experience, like biting into the corn, and you felt like all the juices like exploding when you like bite into it, and you're like peaking on LSD at the same time, and it's just like this sensory overload. So we got excited about food. So we started eating some more snacks, and we busted out the fruit. And it was really cold. Even though we were next to the fire, it was still very cold outside. And I remember eating strawberries, and we were all so like fascinated by the texture and everything that was going on with the strawberries. And I remember that I was like biting them, and because my hands were so cold and the strawberries were also cold and my sense of boundaries was being dissolved, I was like almost biting my fingers because I like couldn't tell the difference. Like they both just felt like dead cold things like in front of my mouth. So I was just kind of going for it. And so that was just kind of weird.
Speaking of having a blurred sense of depth perception and spatial awareness, That's exactly what I was experiencing when I was eating the strawberries. I was holding the strawberry and I couldn't tell if it was small or large. I could only feel the molecules that they were comprised of. And even as I was looking at it, I was staring at it, trying to pinpoint the size of this strawberry, and I just couldn't. I was just stuck on that thought, just not knowing how big the strawberry was. I could only just feel the molecules. There was nothing else, just matter in my fingertips. And it was hard to eat the strawberry because I couldn't understand it. I did ultimately eat it because strawberries are confused Unga Bunga.
So after that, we just kept hanging out and talking by the fire, and little did we know that Miracle had turned on her voice recording, and so we actually captured a little bit of our conversation while we were tripping. So I'll put a little bit of it here. Yeah, I'd really like to see a world in the future where we almost have like a planetary Magna Carta, you know, that this spaceship Earth is a sacred organism. It shouldn't be treated any other way.
Right.
And that we're all part of it, so we shouldn't be treated any other way.
Absolutely.
But we should all be working to improve the status of everything else.
Yeah.
In conjunction. I think we need something like that for our times, you know, like a new constitution or a new Magna Carta sort of thing, you know, like let's put it on paper
I'm
or something.
hoping that it's something environmentally, you know, like we were talking
It
earlier,
has to
but
be.
like that's the one thing that'll unify every human being,
Yeah,
like
right,
anything
yeah.
that resides, even like earlier you said, even the ones who can't express themselves, but every being, every living thing, you know, it needs to be adequately represented, I should say. There's not an even distribution of say-so.
No, because think about how many House of Representatives we'd really have if you included every subspecies of plant and critter that roam this damn place, you know? You'd have to do a whole lot of representing. And
we're the only ones with mouths.
Yeah.
Someone has to advocate for them, though.
It's it's an old system that was like abused and taken too far, because it's like we can justify it by saying, well, hey, it's got us this far.
I mean, yeah, it's working, so why rock the boat?
Yeah, right?
While the boat is sinking.
Yeah,
slowly but surely. But
and then you realize we're all just swimming.
at one point when we were sitting on the log, Cam mentioned that he felt as if the three of us were just sitting at the edge of the universe, and that maybe there's this intergalactic, interdimensional being looking down on us and pointing at the three of us and being like, hey, you three, quit fucking off over there. Because we were just acting fools at this point. Mm-hmm. In the same vein as what I was saying earlier about being transported to a different dimension, that was still happening. My physical body was in this plane, but my spirit was tiptoeing between different dimensions, and one of the realms was the realms of my ancestors, and another realm was the DMT realm that I had experienced in a previous, the very first time that I did it, which there's actually a trip report on the channel for. So as I was tiptoeing through different dimensions, I also felt as if something was awry with the dimension that I was physically in. And at one point I remember feeling as if at any point Tyler and Cam were going to just kind of reveal, like remove their disguise and reveal themselves as ancient guardians of the multiverse, and that they were going to rip apart the fabric of my reality and show me everything as it was. It was almost comical and cartoonish in the way that my brain was expecting it to happen, like very like Tasmanian devil, like, you know, spinning and ta-da, just really vaudevillian and just almost very clown-like, almost like the trickster archetype. That's what I was expecting both of them to kind of reveal themselves in that manner.
So at this point, we bust out this giant space book that I had that has these, like, the book is literally like 2.5 feet tall and like 1.5 feet wide. It's a huge book. It's like, it says something on the cover like a giant book for a giant subject, because it's full of like these massive celestial objects. So we bust out the book and we're like kind of riding the plateau of our peak, and we were looking at all of these images, and they're just like all these pictures of nebula and galaxies, and they were just so colorful and rich, and especially whenever you're tripping that hard, so the visual distortion you're getting on top of it, it just kind of like all of the colors and shapes and everything, they just like melt into this like tender, it's like a very tender feeling. I don't know how to describe it, but I just feel a very tender connection to the colors and the shapes, and it looked like the finest watercolor paintings that someone could ever make. And I was also just feeling this profound feeling from it, because I know that we are a result of these nebulae and these birth of stars. Like these colorful things that we see in the spacebook, that is what we are too. We are just like what happens after those big colorful supernova explosions, and when matter coalesces and beings evolve. Like, so just having that sense of like dissolving the boundary between me and that which is like truly our primordial essence in a way. So that was just like really hitting hard when I was tripping.
So as I was looking at the book, it seemed as if the stars were moving into place. They were all just coming together and moving to formulate this really intricate mandala pattern.
This would have been in November 2016. So this was actually just like a couple of weeks after Trump got elected. So we were talking about that and like just trying to figure it all out, because it was kind of a shock to everybody that he had actually won, and you know, he just seemed like such an asshole. And so we were just kind of thinking about that and shooting ideas around, and one of the things that came up was how we saw him almost as if he was like a spoiled child who like didn't get enough love, and he was like crying out for attention this whole time, even though he's in his late 70s and very dangerous. We all just need to talk, humans.
That's what we need to do. Get together.
Can we organize a family meeting?
Could we, please?
Let's go back to the Melon Brooks. They got nice iced tea.
You put Donald Trump in a corner. Like, stop being a brat, man. Just have quiet time. Come back in 5 minutes. Talk to me then. So I remember feeling essentially the same way. There really, to me, was no excuse for somebody to act that way towards other humans, other than there's probably some deep-rooted issues there. And it really seemed as if the idea of an echo chamber, of someone supporting him so heavily, regardless of how ridiculous their beliefs and motives may be, it was all validation. It was all, he's a child who never got enough love and attention, and this idea of an entire country validating him and also giving him the attention and the love that he never had as a child. So I felt as if that's where the deep-rooted issues with our former president lie, but who knows? I mean, it was kind of sad to think about, and you know, because how else would you justify treating somebody so terribly? Or a bunch of people so terribly. So
we put on another CD, and this time it was one that I had brought. We were putting on A Love Supreme by John Coltrane, and he's crazy. On this song, he's doing the same riff, and it's kind of like a mantra of repeating the love supreme, a love supreme, but he's changing the key and doing the same phrase over and over again. So he's jumping all over the place. A love supreme, a love supreme, a love supreme. And when he was doing that, it felt like he was painting a sigil on the ground, and I was actually like hallucinating this kind of geometric circular sigil on the ground, and it was as if his music and what he, like, all the key changes he was doing, he was like connecting the dots of the geometry of music and how all of that stuff works, and it was really intense. And I felt like he was creating this kind of holographic painting on the ground, and it was like, you know, the whole album's very spiritual, and it's about connecting to like the deepest source, or, you know, some people call it God, and that another name for it is a love supreme. So it was just this really mind-blowing thing, and I feel like if you haven't heard that album on acid, then you haven't really heard it yet.
So while we were listening to A Love Supreme, I felt as if I was getting a sense of synesthesia, because as I was listening to the different key changes, it was creating different colors. And while I was listening to the melody, that color became a line, a sort of line segment that was dancing to the melody. And what I was envisioning when I would close my eyes, my closed-eye visuals were essentially a three-dimensional grid, X, Y, Z, and this line was traveling and creating a pattern, a visual pattern with each note and with each ascension and with each dip in the melody. It was a visual depiction of what I was listening to, and each key was a different color. And so when I closed my eyes, that's what I would see. After that, we went and stood at the edge of our campsite and looked up at the sky, because it was a clear night, no cloud in sight, and we could see every single star as best as we could. And I remember looking up at the stars, and the same thing that was happening with the space book, where there was that kaleidoscopic filter over everything, except when I looked up at the sky, they were exactly where they needed to be. It was almost as if they were in a pre-calculated pattern. I was looking up and I was seeing that pattern clearly, and our place in it as well. And I could feel the rotation of the earth, the revolution of the earth around the sun, and the solar system's movement within the Milky Way. And so it just went macro really quickly as I was looking up at the stars. I remember seeing at one point almost a face in the stars, and it smiled at me. And I remember feeling so much love looking up at the sky and seeing the stars smiling down at me. I felt so loved, and I felt so excited and just so happy to experience that love from this celestial being. I don't think it was an actual being. I don't know what it was actually. It's still a mystery. But I remember feeling a lot of love and feeling a lot of joy from seeing the smile on the star's face. That's such a funny thing to say. So I actually ended up writing a poem about that exact moment. So this is the poem. Compacted compounds creating consciousness. Collaborative cosmic chaos questioning creation. Falling, flying, flowing. Vibrant vibrations vivaciously victorious. Varying velocities veer vocalizations. Gone, going. Reaping repetitive recycled rhetoric. Readying realizations. Seeing, staying, sowing.
Did you write that on acid or after?
I wrote that after. I wrote that whenever I came home and I thought about the trip, and that's the best way that I could describe what I was feeling in the moment.
That's such a beautiful way to like remember part of your trip.
Yeah. It was probably the most significant experience I've had.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
It's up there.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Damn.
Years later, I was listening to one of my favorite albums, Steal This Album by System of a Down, and this song called Inner Vision, there's at one point he says, stars in their place mirror your face. And I mean, I'd been listening to this song for years, since I was 10 years old. And when I heard those lyrics years after that LSD trip, it just clicked. And inner vision to me is about that same type of experience, an enlightening, insightful, mystical experience, an inner vision. And hearing that line reminded me of when I was looking up at the stars and the stars were smiling at me. And so maybe it was that the stars were mirroring my face, the joy and the love that I was feeling. That's what it was mirroring. And so I thought that was really interesting.
So one of the last things that I can recall about this trip was that when we were laying down in the tent trying to go to sleep, it felt like the LSD molecule or the LSD experience was like this thing that was like latched on to me. And in the case of our neurotransmitters, that is what's happening. The LSD molecule is like latched on, but I felt this like in my spirit, and it felt like the immensity of what the LSD experience was so huge that it couldn't just disappear. It felt like I was watching like a spaceship fly away, but like it was still very much like this cosmic ordeal. It's really hard to explain it, but it felt like it was this huge presence and that it was gonna last with me even after the trip, that it was just like this thing that had affected me and moved through me so much that it wasn't something that would lightly disappear. It was something that was gonna basically just keep fading and fading and fading, but so slow that it sticks with you for like a really long time. So it's really hard to describe this sensation, but that's the best I can. So overall, I think what I would integrate from this experience are just probably two main things. One of them was this feeling that I had that love was a revolutionary act. Because you know how we were talking about the Trump election and how, you know, cruel and careless that some people can be towards other humans. And like in this environment, showing love and things like that is an act of revolution. So I just really had this profound sense that was true, and I felt it in my core, like that love was the way to go. And this comes up a lot in psychedelic trips, but I had never kind of put together the idea of it being a revolutionary act, like an actual revolution to show love. I think the other thing that I got from it was the experience of listening to that music with John Coltrane and Bjork, especially that kind of sense of pagan spirit and connection to nature. This is actually the first time that I had taken LSD in nature, so it did have a very much more like mystical, foresty vibe to it, because that's the first time I've been in that environment tripping like that. And so this pagan theme of like worshiping nature or just feeling connected to nature, it really hit home, and just like it was all coalescing and resonating really, really well. So that would probably be my main takeaway from this experience. So what about you?
So my main takeaways were, the first one was that, well, now I feel as if my ancestry is why I'm attracted to psychedelics, because my parents are both from El Salvador, and on my mom's side there is, to this day, native people from ancient Mayan civilizations, and a lot of those medicines and traditions have been passed down. And my mom and my dad often say if they were back home, they could just walk to the backyard, pull off a leaf from something, chew it up, and put it on a cut, and it's not going to get infected. I think that part of the reason why I was attracted to psychedelics was because of my Mayan ancestry, because maybe that's something that's ingrained within my DNA. My second takeaway would be the love for myself that I felt. Having that moment in the mirror where I found myself attractive and felt so much love for myself was huge. And I think that I don't feel that way all the time now, but I do feel as if I have value, and that, you know, and even the idea of attraction that's a whole nother conversation for another day. But I definitely love myself more because of that experience. And the last thing was the interconnectedness to space. I know that there's that connection there, and I've always been just mildly aware of it, but looking up into the cosmos and feeling the movement of everything and where the earth is in relation to all of that was significant to me. It was pivotal, really, because I needed to know that interconnectedness so that I could pursue the career field that I'm in now.
Nice. That's going to be it for this one. If you made it this far, you're a real one. Appreciate you. And goodbye. Do you have anything else to say?
Yeah, if you're still here watching this, thank you so much. We genuinely appreciate it. Please feel free to comment about what you might have heard or something that you might relate to or it resonates with you. We love to hear that. But we cannot thank you enough for sticking around and listening to the story in its entirety.
All right. Peace.
Bye.